Okay, we've got a pair of Zelda stories. We're going to start with the editor of Game Informer. They say, and I'm hopeful about this, but they say that the next Zelda game will probably be here sooner than we think. They were talking to, they were on the Game Informer podcast, and Imran Khan said this. They said, "I was thinking what I should say about that. The next Zelda will probably be sooner than we think. I will talk to you guys off camera about stuff." I love that stuff, that ever so intangible stuff. Here's my question. What kind of Zelda game do you think we're going to be getting? Because we have a lot of different styles that we could go in. We could go with a 3D Zelda, kind of like Breath of the Wild, where Nintendo's done this before. You look back at the N64 and what some say is the greatest game of all time, Ocarina of Time, came out, and Nintendo wanted to turn around real quick and put out a sequel to that. So they did Majora's Mask using that same engine. And while it didn't happen as fast as Nintendo wanted, it did happen faster than most development times for Zelda games. Most people would say that that was a really successful move, and a lot of people would say that they would love to see more in that Breath of the Wild engine, something else for us to explore, some other land for Link to go to. And I'm with you on that. I think that that would be fantastic. Another direction that they could go is they could go in the direction of a 3D Zelda, or I'm sorry, a 2D Zelda game, kind of like a top-down game. These are the games that we've seen a lot on the DS. We had A Link Between Worlds, where Link could become a two-dimensional painting on a wall and use that to solve puzzles. That was a fantastic game on the 3DS. It was really more of an open world game than a lot of the other Zeldas up to that point, because you could go wherever you wanted at any time and end up renting the items that, like there was a guy who took over your house, and you would go to your house and you would rent like the hook shot from him, and then you would go to the hook shot dungeon and be able to complete that. And that allowed the player to decide, well, I want to start over here, and then I'm going to do this dungeon next, and that one after that, and so on. And I thought that was really fun and compelling. It was a really good game, had a lot of really good puzzles, and the 3D in that game was really fantastic. Now, I think that this is much more likely the move. Oh, actually, I almost forgot. We could also see something like a multiplayer Zelda. We've seen things like Zelda Four Swords. We've seen Triforce Heroes, which had 3-player co-op. Now, that has not worked so well in the past. Zelda Four Swords worked fine, but that meant everybody had to be in the same room. Triforce Heroes didn't work nearly as well over the internet, and that's because the 3DS is, of course, a system that has no way to connect to wired internet. And every time that I played it, I ran into issues where I'd be waiting for somebody's internet to catch up, and it ended up just being kind of a chore to play that game. It worked really well when it was me and my wife and my son all sitting together in one room. That worked really well, but playing the game over the internet wasn't so great. And that's because Nintendo is famously bad at netcode, I think. So there's our three options. We've got our traditional 3D Zelda, our traditional 2D Zelda, and then a multiplayer option. And which of those things do we think that we'll end up seeing? That's really the question. I think, here's my prediction: if the guy at Game Informer is on the up and up here, and if he is correct, then I think that we will be seeing a 2D traditional Zelda top-down style, where you are maybe doing like maybe a callback to the Super Nintendo days, like we have had in the past. That kind of thing, that kind of art style. I think that would work very well on the Switch. The the battery life for that would be really, really long. Like you could probably play a game like that for 5 to 8 hours because it wouldn't soak up that battery quite so much like Breath of the Wild did. And it would also serve as a really good palate cleanser because if a 3D Zelda comes out right on the heels of Breath of the Wild, then it's going to have a huge issue. That issue is perception. People are going to look at that, and if the game is not better than Breath of the Wild, and that's really hard to do, but if the game's not better than Breath of the Wild, then everybody's going to write it off as terrible. And that's not fair, but that's just the way that the internet is. People expect you to do better every single time. So I think having a 2D Zelda as a palate cleanser between 3D Zeldas is a really good idea, if for no other reason than people won't be comparing it to the last Zelda. It'll be very different. And I think that it's something I would get pretty excited about. I've always been a huge fan of the 2D Zelda games. And I really hope that, and here's something that we could get. Maybe it's a remake. Maybe we could get a remake of the Link's Awakening, which was a Game Boy game. And I know that there's a lot of people out there who've never played it, myself included. I would love to see a remake of one of those Zeldas that I've never touched, just because I didn't have a Game Boy at the time. So that's our first story. And then the second one I'm going to go much shorter on, our second Zelda story. And that is Mr. Eiji Onuma. He was the producer. Yeah, he was the producer of Breath of the Wild. And he's been working on Zelda games for a very, very long time. This comes to us via Nintendo Insider. But he has said basically this: Breath of the Wild will never be placed in the timeline. What am I talking about, the timeline? Well, internet nerds, like myself, kind of took all of the different Zelda games, which are unrelated, and tried to build a timeline out of those. And I think what Nintendo did is they didn't really worry about the overarching story of the Zelda series. They just worried about, what are we going to do in this version of Zelda? And then they looked at what people had come up with and they said, oh, that's kind of cool. Why don't we just go with that? The internet will be like, we did it, Reddit. And then everybody will be happy. And then Breath of the Wild comes out, and it opens up even in the preview with 100 years ago. So everybody's like, well, when does this take place? Does this take place before everything else, or does it take place after everything else? Is this a third timeline? And here's the hard and fast truth here, people. I don't think Nintendo cares. I don't think that Nintendo cares where in the timeline Zelda games take place. Because Nintendo has always just been about two things: fun and gameplay. They've never really been good at compelling storylines. Now, that's not to say that there aren't Nintendo games that don't have good storylines, but that's not their milieu. That's not their forte. That's not where their bread is buttered. Their bread is buttered on awesome gameplay and great mechanics. And that's what Nintendo does really, really well. So the fact that Mr. Onuma says that we're not going to put this in the timeline, it makes a lot of sense to me, because that feels like wasted brain power. Here's exactly what he said. He said, the final thing I'd like to convey to all of our players is that video games, not just Zelda, can go much, much farther. We get a lot of responses from adult players who say that they felt the same way playing this game as they did when they used to be hooked on the video games when they were younger. We made this game with the intention of returning to our roots. So the response from players about them feeling the way they had when they were young is promising. Here we go. In books like the recently released Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia, we revealed where each Zelda game fell on a timeline and how their stories related. they stole it from the internet. And I'm okay with that. But we didn't do that for Breath of the Wild. There is a reason for that. With this game, we saw just how many players were playing in their own way and had those reactions I mentioned. We realized that people were enjoying imagining the story that emerged from the fragmental imagery that we were providing. If we defined a restricted timeline, then there would be a definitive story, and it would eliminate the room for imagination, which wouldn't be as fun. He finally goes on to say at the end, we want players to be able to continue having fun imagining this world even after they are finished with the game. So this time, we decided that we would avoid making clarifications. I hope that everyone can find their own answer in their own way. And I think that's a wonderful answer. And more to the point, for me, when I played, like I was talking to somebody a while back about Zelda, and they were like, well, don't spoil anything. And I was like, well, don't worry about that, because the game has no story. And I know that there's people who will say, well, Bill, you're full of crap. The game has a great story. And okay, that's fine. But I think that the game has a different story for every player. Because when you talk about the story of Breath of the Wild, what you're really talking about is the memories that we see throughout the game. But when I talk about the story of Breath of the Wild, I talk about that time that I found some arrows and then shot them through the fire at the bombs in the Bokoblin camp and blew them up just as a Lionel saw me and charged in to beat me about the head and shoulders with his giant mace. That's the story of the game that I felt. It's not a story of Link. It's my story that I experienced, or that time when I killed like 6 Lizalfos only to have a blood moon trigger right then to resurrect them all, and I had to fight them all over again. Those are these moments that I experienced in the game, and that's my story for Zelda. And it makes perfect sense with what Mr. Aonuma is saying here. And I'm curious as to how you guys feel about that. Do you think that he is that I'm right, that we shouldn't bother with the overall chronology of the Zelda franchise? Or should it be something that we pay more attention to? Let me know what you guys think.